September 1942. El Alamein, Egypt. Twice a day, German reconnaissance aircraft crossed the front on a schedule as steady as a metronome. They did not look for scenery. They looked for proof, a fresh set of tracks, a camp's shadow that had widened, a camouflage net with an edge too straight to belong in nature. In the narrow corridor between the Mediterranean and the Qatar Depression, a major concentration showed up in aerial film the way ink shows up on clean paper. Field Marshal Montgomery, commanding the Allied 8th Army, knew he had to attack. He also knew the enemy had to be wrong about direction and timing. Ordinary concealment had stopped working. The problem was no longer how to hide. It was how to control what the enemy believed he was seeing. The solution was fixed one afternoon in September. It ran on two lines, north and south, like two acts in a precise script. On the southern line, about 20 miles behind the front, a camouflage company began work in bare desert. Their tools were not rifles. They were saws, hammers, canvas, and stage paint pulled from a Cairo theater warehouse. They were going to build an armored formation that did not exist. Sergeant John Miller, a furniture carpenter before the war, was put in charge of the dummy Sherman frames. The team's drawings came from a real tank unit's side and top profiles. The shapes had to be adjusted, not to please a mechanic, but to satisfy an aerial camera and the analysts who studied the prints. "Remember," Miller told the men around him, "we're fooling a lens at 500 meters, not eyes on the ground. The wheels don't have to turn, but the shadow has to read right. The gun barrel doesn't have to be steel, but the angle has to match a real barrel." They nailed pine into skeletal hulls, stretched sand-colored canvas over the ribs, and from above the outline and shadow sat close enough to make a confident viewer hesitate. The hardest part was the detail that only mattered in a photograph. New canvas reflected light differently than canvas that had been scoured by wind and sand. Miller ordered a slurry of mud mixed with sand, then had the men pat it onto the surfaces to dull the sheen and roughen the texture. Trucks dragged special rakes through the sand to press wide tread patterns into the ground. The first day's batch looked convincing at a glance, but Miller treated convincing as a danger. Convincing is where a man stops looking. The next morning, a British liaison aircraft flew low and took pictures for internal checks. 2 hours later, the prints were in Miller's hands. He held them up to the sun, and his expression tightened. All 4 tanks threw shadows in the same direction, with the same length and the same clean edge. It was perfect. Too perfect. Real tanks on real ground never line up that neatly. Slight differences in vehicle orientation and slight rises in the sand introduce small variations, and those variations are exactly what an analyst expects to see. "Reset them tonight," Miller said. "Turn each one 5 to 10 degrees, use a level, build in a half-foot height difference across the group. We want real, not tidy." While the South built what did not exist, the North hid what did. The real armor massed on the northern line, and work began there after dark. The Crusader tanks of the 9th Armored Brigade killed all lights. Engines ran at the lowest idle that would keep them reliable. One by one, the tanks crawled to pre-arranged coordinates. Engineer teams waited with handcarts stacked with folded Sunshield frames. The Sunshield was a collapsible steel frame covered in painted canvas. When opened and locked, it formed a curved canopy. The outline was calculated so that from directly overhead, it matched the standard shape of a 3-ton British truck, with a cab bulge, flatbed lines, and squared-off geometry. Each frame weighed roughly 200 pounds. It took 6 engineers working together to lift and fix it. Sergeant Tom Leslie led the team on the first tank. In darkness, they felt for the mounting points, hoisted the frame over the turret, unfolded it, and locked the joints. The canvas had to be tight. Slack canvas could flap in wind or cast wrinkles that looked wrong in sunlight. The edges were pinned with sandbags and dusted with local sand to make a natural transition into the ground. "Left side down another half-inch," Leslie said, lying flat on the sand. He used a flashlight covered with red cloth to check the edge. The gap between canvas and ground can't be more than a finger. From the air, a straight-line gap is an alarm. Heat from the tanks bled through armor plate into the cold desert night. Sweat-soaked shirts, then chilled. Installing the first Sunshield took 45 minutes. When the last sandbag was set, Leslie stepped back. From 50 yards away, the Crusader had vanished. In its place sat the vague outline of a truck blending into dozens of other trucks that were in truth tanks. Concealment was only the first step. The next morning, Leslie's team was ordered to stage what staff officers called a movement show. 3 of the camouflaged trucks had to be reassigned in daylight to a new area 300 yards away. That meant that in the darkest hour before dawn, they had to strip the sunshields, let the tanks move a short distance, and put the sunshields back, all before their own liaison aircraft's routine photo run. And they could not leave tread marks that would give the game away. Time was tight. Removal was faster than installation, but it still took 20 minutes. The tanks started and moved at minimum speed along a path of laid canvas, used to prevent soft sand from taking a crisp track. Once in place, the engineers rebuilt the disguise. As the eastern sky began to pale, Leslie lay on the ground and brushed the last patch of sand to smooth away a faint crease where a tread had compressed the canvas edge. "The camera plane's coming," an observer hissed. Leslie waved his men back and backed out himself, using a branch to smear away footprints as he retreated. They reached a trench just as the liaison aircraft passed overhead. Leslie listened to the engine and kept his breath under control. He did not know whether the photos would betray them, whether the 300-yard shift had left a trace they could not erase. The answer would not come until afternoon. That dual pressure, technical accuracy and tight timing defined daily life for the deception teams. And in rear headquarters, the unit coordinating the wider plan, Operation Bertram, faced a larger problem: how to make the enemy believe a complete story. Major Carter, an architect before the war, managed the plan like a blueprint. His office walls were covered in aerial photos, maps and schedules. His work was not to build a single decoy, it was to weave logic that would hold under repeated observation. "The southern buildup must look like it's preparing," he told intelligence and engineer officers at the morning brief. "So we give it a timetable. Week 1, the number of dummy tanks increases by 10% per day. Week 2, we begin dummy gun positions and a dummy headquarters. Week 3, we lay a dummy field fuel pipeline using empty drums and canvas tubing. Week 4, the final week before the attack, activity peaks. Simulated radio traffic increases. Dummy truck convoys run in and out. At night, we manufacture the kind of bustle that makes an observer say, 'They're getting ready.'" He moved to the map of the north. "And here, the real armor assembly area must look like a maintenance logistics node. Truck numbers rise slowly. Activity follows routine. Each morning convoys leave for forward supply points. Each evening they return. Weekends show less movement. We need some broken-down vehicles parked on the edges long-term. We can use real wrecked trucks, or we can keep a few disguised tanks looking shabby." He paused and looked around the room. "The most critical part is traces. The South needs tread marks, digging scars, and the messy pattern of heavy manpower. The North needs mostly wheel tracks, and not too dense, not too fresh. Starting today, we have a dedicated trace management team. Their job is to inspect, repair, and manufacture ground evidence every day." A tank captain raised his hand. "Major, my men are complaining about hiding under canvas all day. They want to know when this masquerade ends." Carter met his eyes. "Tell them it ends when the Germans move their reserves and anti-tank guns south, instead of placing them on your real route. Until then, every fold in canvas and every direction of a track is a wager placed for that moment." After the meeting, Carter stood alone by the map. He knew the greatest risk was not that a single decoy would be spotted. A clumsy decoy could be dismissed and might even mislead. The greatest risk was a break in rhythm. If the southern preparations stalled, if the northern truck pattern ceased to make logistical sense, If weather shattered the schedule, the narrative would collapse. They had to keep that narrative alive for 4 full weeks. At El Alamein, the balance began to move before any shell landed, in the tension of canvas, the accuracy of wooden frames, and the deliberate shaping of every false trace in sand. This was not the kind of fighting most soldiers understood. It was a vast, silent, visual engineering project, ruthless about detail. Its central paradox was simple. You used steel, wood, cloth, and sand, the most physical materials on the battlefield, to build a lie. Then you relied on the enemy to study thousands of photographs and convince himself the lie was true. The first day ended. In the south, Miller's adjusted dummy tanks passed the second internal aerial check. In the north, Leslie's movement show left no obvious breach on the photos. Nobody celebrated. Everyone understood this was only the opening. The first week's performance advanced with near obsessive discipline. Each day, Carter's office received new aerial photos from both lines, taken by their own liaison aircraft to check progress. The prints went up on the wall, and officers marked questionable points with colored pencils. In the south, Miller's decoy position grew to 30 tanks and 12 guns. They built more complex stagecraft, a dummy divisional headquarters made of canvas tents, with a few real jeeps parked outside but with their markings covered, and a dummy antenna array that was nothing more than poles and wire. By day, soldiers dressed as signalers moved between tents. By night, the camp stayed dark except for 1 or 2 carefully shielded lamps to suggest a duty watch. "We need signs of life," Miller told his crew. "Not parade ground neatness. The mess of a place people have lived in." They scattered empty tins around the tents, all British brands. They left a few camouflage edges slightly torn instead of repairing them. Beside the dummy tanks, they built the outline of a maintenance shed with crates and canvas. They had men dig shallow pits before dawn and fill them back in to mimic the cycle of field latrines. Signs of life created new problems. One morning, a sudden desert whirlwind tore through the dummy area. 2 fake tents went airborne with their frames, landing 50 yards away. A dummy Sherman's canvas gun barrel ripped open. Miller led his men into the storm to salvage the scene. Everything had to be restored before any enemy aircraft arrived. "Use spare canvas. If a frame breaks, lash it with wire. Smooth every drag mark in the sand," Miller shouted into the wind. Men dropped to their knees and used their bodies to pin down canvas while others drove stakes back into place. Repairs took 2 hours. Everyone ended with sand in his mouth and eyes burning. When the wind died, the site looked normal again. Up close, the fixes were rough. Miller could only hope the enemy aircraft would not fly too low and that any patchwork would read as routine maintenance rather than an admission. The pressure in the north came from a different direction. Leslie's engineers grew accustomed to working night after night. Their hands developed calluses from cold steel and rough canvas. The hardest part was not the work. It was the forced stillness between shifts. The 9th Armoured Brigade's crews were ordered to remain under disguise. Except for rare necessity, they could not start engines and could not leave their tanks. In daylight, the sun turned canvas-covered tanks into ovens. Inside temperatures rose above 50 degrees Celsius. Men took turns crawling under the hull into the narrow strip of shade to breathe. Water was rationed because extra resupply traffic meant extra risk. From the south, they could hear occasional engine noise, activity manufactured for the enemy. "We're like rats in a coffin," a tank commander wrote in his diary. "A big show is happening outside, and we're nailed down here without a line. The worst part is not knowing how long it lasts. A day, a week, a month?" Stillness was itself part of the deception, but a real logistics node would not be completely dead. Carter's trace management team went to work. 20 trucks and 40 engineers were tasked with making the north look active, but only in ways consistent with truck traffic. Each morning at first light, a convoy of real trucks drove into the disguised area along a road, roughly pressed with wooden planks. The trucks carried empty crates and canvas rolls that from the air looked like loaded supplies. They stopped for hours at designated unloading points. Engineers acted out unloading, moving empty boxes into piles, and covering them with canvas to form a temporary dump. At dusk, the same trucks, sometimes with a few added or removed, returned along the same route, as if completing a normal supply cycle. Another team maintained ground traces. They dragged special nets made from old fishing netting with tire scraps tied on, pulling them along the perimeter and the road to refresh wheel prints without making them too sharp, too dense, or too new to be believable. Above all, they had to avoid leaving tread marks near Sunshield edges. Those areas could show only wheel tracks and footprints. Perfect control was almost impossible. One afternoon, a new soldier lost his balance while pulling the heavy net. One corner scraped a Sunshield edge, leaving a clear, curved abrasion and lifting a small flap of canvas. The abrasion might not matter. The flap did. It could slap in the wind and throw irregular reflections in sunlight. When the damage was discovered, less than 2 hours remained before a German overflight was expected. Repairing in daylight was dangerous. Not repairing was worse. Leslie received an emergency order. With 2 experienced men, he crawled toward the damaged disguise. They wore sand-colored smocks and used a larger sheet of canvas as a moving screen. Inching forward, at the spot, Leslie assessed quickly. The tier ran about 8 inches. A thin steel rod was bent. There was no time to remove the whole frame. One man pinned the edge down. The other pulled a strong adhesive and a spare patch from a tool bag. Leslie used pliers to bend the rod back as straight as he could. The adhesive needed minutes to set, and the patch had to be pressed tight the entire time. The 3 of them lay flat, palms in the sand, arms trembling from forced stillness. A distant engine sound drifted across the desert, friendly or enemy, they could not tell. Seconds stretched. When the adhesive held, Leslie smeared the patch edges with a staining slurry mixed with sand and pigment so it matched texture and color. They crawled backward and erased their own traces with a branch. Less than 10 minutes after they reached cover, an aircraft's shadow slid across the ground. Nobody could identify the type. Every man kept his breath quiet. That night at the coordination meeting, Carter placed the latest enlarged aerial photo on the table. The disguised area was visible in clear detail. Several officers leaned close. "The patch is here," Carter said, pointing with a pencil to a tiny, darker dot. "If you don't look for it, it's a stain. If our people can see it, the Germans might too." "We got lucky," an intelligence officer said. "Thin cloud today scattered the light. Contrast was lower." "We cannot rely on luck," Carter replied. "Starting tomorrow, every trace management group gets an observer dedicated to spotting accidental damage. And we pre-treat the edges of all disguises with natural wear, so they look as if they've been out there for weeks. Then small tears, read as normal." He turned to another report on radio deception. A signals detachment well behind the front was simulating the traffic of a southern dummy corps. They used real corps-level call signs and codebooks, old ones or ones intended to be compromised, and they followed typical pre-attack patterns: logistics requests, position reports, training coordination, and everyday traffic with low encryption. German listening posts would intercept it and treat it as supporting evidence. "Traffic is up 30% over last week," the signals officer reported. "That matches what we expect for preparation phase 2. "Good," Carter said. "Control the rhythm. Next week, add communications faults and clarification exchanges so it feels like human friction. Meanwhile, the Northern Armor's radio silence must be absolute. One unauthorized transmitter can ruin the entire posture." Pressure came from inside as well as outside. Weeks of work created exhaustion and irritability. Miller began dreaming of canvas and wooden frames. Tank crews grew short-tempered in long confinement. Engineers worked nights until their eyes ringed dark. Complaints multiplied. Would the Germans believe it? Were they wasting time? Carter understood morale. He ordered officers to explain the purpose. Each camouflage job, each manufactured track, each false radio message reduced resistance for the real attack and increased the odds. He also knew speeches were limited. What mattered was evidence, small and specific, that the enemy was reading the story the way they wanted. One day, intelligence delivered a summary of a captured German forward report, obtained by breaking a low-grade cipher. It said a German southern observation post had noted what appeared to be an increasing British armoured concentration in Area 28, near Miller's decoys, estimated at regiment strength, possibly more, with activity continuing to grow. The same report described the north simply. Logistics transport activity, normal. No abnormal concentration observed. The summary was passed cautiously to the key deception commanders. Miller felt a sharp pride when he learned the Germans were watching his work. Leslie felt a colder relief. Their silence and concealment had been accepted as normal. Carter warned them not to loosen. They're watching the south. That's only step one. They have to believe it's the main effort and move reserves and anti-tank guns there. We still have a long road. The second week, then the third, passed in the same pattern. Deception ran like a machine that was itself wearing down. The south expanded again. A dummy field hospital appeared, its Red Cross symbol carefully half-covered. A dummy repair shop appeared, with real hammering sounds as engineers fixed damaged frames. The North's truck numbers rose slowly as planned. The trace team even simulated muddy tracks after rain. At night, they poured water from canteens and used wide tire vehicles to press deeper marks where the ground should look churned. Everyone learned to live with uncertainty, the schedule of enemy aircraft, the changing weather, their own limits. They became soldiers and stagehands at once, maintaining a giant illusion spread across tens of square kilometers, involving thousands of people, sustained for weeks. As the fourth week began, Carter's calendar showed fewer than 10 days until the planned assault. He stared at the map. The southern story was now rich enough and loud enough. The northern real force was now plain enough and believable enough. But the last and most dangerous phase was coming. The real attack force had to move forward toward the start line. The tanks disguised as trucks in the north had to disappear, then reappear closer to the front in fighting posture. That change had to happen without German reconnaissance noticing. At the same time, the South had to keep performing until the last minute, and louder still, to cover the real movement. The last week, Carter told his core team, we drive the South to a climax. Signals, activity, traces, all of it points to one conclusion. The attack will come from there. In the north, we reduce activity, so it looks like logistical focus is shifting south. Then in the final nights, we do the real trick. We pull the tanks out of the truck shells and move them to attack positions. He paused. There was no excitement in his voice, only execution. The hardest part is not starting. It's ending. We change the stage under the enemy's eyes. Until the curtain rises, they must still believe they are watching the previous act. The desert sunset turned the landscape red. There were fewer than 200 hours until the night when every disguise had to be perfect, then ripped away in an instant. Every minute demanded precision and silence. 7 days before the assault, Carter's office became a prison of time. Every date was circled in red. Each circle carried a list of actions that had to be completed. The deception entered its most delicate phase. Starting today, increase southern activity by 50%, Carter ordered. Double radio traffic, but add more complaints about equipment failures, supply delays, and sandstorms slowing progress. Ground traces get denser. At night we allow more light leakage, as if urgency is forcing sloppiness. We want them to believe the southern attack is imminent, maybe slipping slightly because our preparations aren't complete. The north received the opposite order. All truck activity starts decreasing tomorrow, day by day, Carter told the armored and engineer commanders. Simulate logistical priorities shifting south. Trace management reduces frequency so some wheel tracks look days old. But we keep a minimum of maintenance activity. We do not go dead. The true challenge was converting the northern armor from disguise posture to attack posture without detection. The operation was named Midnight Change. It was scheduled to begin 48 hours before the assault. Leslie's team received new tools, not for installing Sunshields, but for stripping them fast. They drilled until the motions became automatic. Each engineer was assigned specific clips and joints, using silent spanners with rubber-wrapped metal. The removal time for one Sunshield was forced down to 20 minutes. Every piece removed had to be loaded immediately onto waiting trucks and driven away. No large parts could be left behind. When you strip the sand off the canvas edges, do it carefully, Leslie said during rehearsals. We can't leave wide patches of fresh sand. Frame parts on the trucks have to be bundled and covered so they don't reflect. And silence matters. Metal impacts carry. In the south, Miller received a more theatrical assignment. On the night before the assault, you stage a light show, Carter explained personally. A dozen trucks drive back and forth behind the dummy area, headlights on, but covered with heavy canvas hoods slit into narrow openings. From distance, it looks like blackout lamps during night movement. In several dummy headquarters tents, light kerosene lamps and make the shadows move across the canvas. We give the Germans a last shot of certainty. Miller frowned. That invites artillery. It may, Carter admitted. If they fire, they'll shell empty ground. We need their attention pinned south. 4 days before the assault, German reconnaissance seemed to intensify focus on the south. Aircraft crossed 3 times in 1 day. Miller's position endured the strictest camera inspection so far. One dummy gun's shadow angle was slightly off because a wooden support had settled. A dummy dump's canvas corner had blown open. Photos were analyzed urgently. Engineers risked quick adjustments in the gaps between passes. Nerves tightened hard. In the north, under cover of reduced activity, real preparation accelerated at night. Tank crews received extra fuel and ammunition delivered by vehicles disguised as water tankers. Unloading points were under the disguised tanks or close beside them. Engines received final checks, but tests had to be run in covered sound-dampened pits, holes engineers had dug in secret over several nights. 2 nights before the assault, midnight change began. At 10 p.m., the northern disguise area sat in complete darkness. Then engineers moved like shadows out of trenches and onto assigned tanks. Leslie was responsible for the first Crusader in his sector. His team worked by habit. 2 stabilized the base, 2 released main clips, 2 folded canvas, 2 passed parts back to trucks. Steel frames were lowered and wrapped in dark felt. Canvas was rolled and tied. The only sounds were fabric rubbing and careful breathing. On the 3rd tank, the plan nearly broke. A connector had seized from sand-grit corrosion. The silent spanner could not turn it. Leslie tried penetrating oil, but time bled away. He signaled the men to wrap the part in canvas, then used a small hammer to tap the spanner handle. The dull thud sounded too loud in the dead night. Everyone froze and listened for aircraft or patrols. A distant engine sound drifted across the desert, friendly or enemy unknown. Sweat formed on Leslie's forehead. He tapped again. The seized bolt finally gave way. All night, dozens of work sites performed the same silent dance. Remove, load, haul away. The ground showed rectangular, clean prints where frames had pressed the sand for weeks, surrounded by older, wind-roughened surface. Those prints could not be erased quickly, but the plan had anticipated them. From the air, they would read as the marks of trucks parked long-term, then moved. Before dawn, all removable disguise equipment had been hauled away. The former truck park disappeared, replaced by empty sand and a grid of tanks in orderly ranks, engines warming at idle without lights. Tank crews climbed out after nearly a month and checked weapons in the cold morning air. Few spoke. The tension built up over weeks turned into a quiet readiness. That same night in the south, the performance grew louder. Miller ran the light show as planned. Trucks crawled along designated lanes. Their masked headlights drifted across the desert like moving points of light. In dummy headquarters tents, soldiers shifted screens in front of kerosene lamps so shadows moved on canvas. A few deliberate muffled shouts carried and a controlled metal clink. The plan was for German forward observers to see or hear it and report that British forces in the south were making final preparations. The last day before the assault, October 23, 1942, was unnaturally quiet. German reconnaissance aircraft flew as usual, and their attention seemed weighted toward the south. Carter's intelligence staff listened for any sign the Germans had seen through the deception. That afternoon, a decrypted low-level message showed a German southern unit requesting more anti-tank ammunition because it expected the main British armor to attempt a breakthrough in the southern sector in the coming days. The North requested nothing urgent. "They believe it," Carter told his adjutant. There was no joy in his voice. Only fatigue and the caution of a man who knows that one last mistake can still ruin the plan. But that's not enough. They have to move reserves. Night fell. It was the night of the main assault. At 9 p.m., British artillery positions stripped off their camouflage nets. At 10, the northern tank mass began to creep forward along lanes marked by white tape and dim guidelights placed by engineers. Engines were held low. Spacing was wide. Behind the tanks, sweep teams dragged nets and used brooms to erase tread marks as best they could. In darkness, it was impossible to be perfect. The goal now was only to avoid provoking suspicion before the guns opened. At 11, the southern dummy area suddenly came alive. Every permitted vehicle light, still masked, flashed on and off to mimic mass startups. Radio traffic hit its peak, flooding the air with plain language and low-grade encrypted messages, packed with last-minute instructions and unit status reports. It was the final push of misdirection. At 9:40 p.m. on October the 23rd, 1942, the British line fell into complete silence. Then the north erupted. 1,000 guns fired at once and tore the night apart. Flashes lit the tanks that had just reached their start positions, barrels aimed at the enemy line. The barrage was not scattered. It was concentrated on planned breach sectors. It was heavier than the Germans expected because a significant share of their resources had been placed on the wrong southern line. The first hours of confusion favored the British. German command struggled with contradiction. The north was under massive fire, and an armoured assault was clearly coming there, yet weeks of reconnaissance and signals had pointed to the south as the main effort. Was the north a feint? Was it a full attack? Shifting reserves took time. Every minute of hesitation widened the opening for British armour. The battle's full course is another story, but Operation Bertram achieved its purpose. It induced hesitation at the decisive moment, reinforced a wrong judgment of the main direction, and placed key resources in the wrong place. When British tanks rolled over the forward defences under artillery cover, the density of anti-tank fire they faced was lower than planners had estimated without the deception. Deception did not win the battle. Infantry assaults, tank attacks, artillery fire, and the courage of soldiers won the battle. But deception created a better starting condition. It compressed the enemy's reaction time and increased uncertainty in his decisions. Carter had said it plainly. They were not doing magic. They were lowering the quality of the enemy's judgment. Long after the battle, some of the deception soldiers learned the scale of what they had done. Miller's dummy area drew substantial German shelling. A few of his engineers were wounded by fragments during the light show, among the only direct casualties tied to the deception itself. Leslie received recognition for his performance during Midnight Change, but what stayed with him was the seized bolt and the moment the dull hammer taps sounded too loud, followed by nights waking to the memory of metal on metal. Major Carter received no public praise. Details of the success were classified to prevent an opponent from studying and countering the methods. Later, he contributed to planning the larger Operation Bodyguard before the Normandy landings, applying Alamain's lessons on a broader stage. In historical shorthand, Operation Bertram is often reduced to an anecdote about fake tanks fooling the enemy. Those who lived it knew it was larger than a trick. It was a systematic attack on the observe and judge chain. When physical concealment was impossible, they attacked cognition. It proved that truth on a battlefield can be shaped not by pure invention, but by selectively displaying facts. Real tanks were disguised as trucks. Dummy positions were built in real locations. Real radio waves carried misleading messages. Everything the enemy saw was physically real. The conclusion he drew from it was wrong. Alamain's sand eventually swallowed the traces. The wooden skeletons of the dummy tanks turned to dust. Sunshield frames were recovered and melted down or left to rust. Today, the satellite view shows flat ground and nothing else. But the core paradox remains. When you cannot make the enemy not see, how do you make him see wrong? The answer was not a flash of inspiration. It was engineering. Hands in the dark fixing canvas edges, drawings that calculated shadow angles, discipline that held for weeks without slackening, and a calm mind that kept the narrative intact under pressure. In the end, what decided Alamein was not only steel and explosives. It was also wood, canvas, imagination, and a long, silent insistence that the enemy accept the wrong story his own observation led him to. When the guns finally opened, it was not only the start of the assault, It was the moment a precision project of seeing built over hundreds of hours was finally complete.